Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's investigation, I hope your day treated you well, wherever you are in the world. Whether it's late evening where you're listening, or perhaps you're on the other side of the globe catching this during your morning commute, thank you for being here. If you're new to our channel, we explore the stories that mainstream media won't touch. The cases that get buried, the witnesses who disappear, and the truth that powerful people never want you to hear. If these investigations resonate with you, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. Your support helps us continue digging where others fear to tread. Tonight's story isn't just another conspiracy theory. It's about a journalist who vanished while investigating what might be the most dangerous cover-up in American political history. His name was Eli Mercer, and what he uncovered in the cornfields of Nebraska changed everything we thought we knew about power, corruption, and how far the elite will go to protect their darkest secrets. This is the story of the Whisper Network, and what they buried in Omaha. Eli Mercer had been out of investigative journalism for 3 years when the package arrived. After his newspaper folded, another casualty of the digital age, he'd been scraping by with freelance work, mostly local interest pieces, and the occasional corporate communications gig. Nothing that would win awards, nothing that would change the world. Just survival journalism in an industry that seemed to be dying by degrees. The package had no return address, just his name and apartment number written in careful block letters. Inside, wrapped in bubble wrap like someone's precious family heirloom, was a VHS tape. The label, handwritten in the same careful script, read, "Conspiracy of Silence. Final cut. Not for broadcast." Eli almost threw it away. In 2019, who still sent VHS tapes? But something about the phrase, "not for broadcast," nagged at him. He'd heard that title before, somewhere in the back alleys of journalism school discussions about censored documentaries and stories that never saw the light of day. He found an old VCR at a pawn shop for $20 and spent the better part of an evening trying to get it to work with his television. The tape was damaged, long stretches of static punctuated by brief, haunting glimpses of interviews and archival footage. Most of it was too corrupted to understand, but one section played with crystal clarity. A man's voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "They killed Rusty. They said he'd hung himself, but I saw him the night before he died. I saw the bruises around his neck, finger marks. He was telling the truth about what happened to those kids, and they couldn't let him keep talking." The voice broke off into static, but those words echoed in Eli's mind for days. Who was Rusty? What had he been saying about children? And why had someone sent this broken documentary to a washed-up journalist in a Chicago apartment? Eli began to research. Conspiracy of Silence had indeed been a real documentary, produced in 1994 by British filmmakers for the Discovery Channel. It was supposed to expose a massive child trafficking scandal centered around the Franklin Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska. The documentary was completed, scheduled to air, and then mysteriously pulled from broadcast just days before its intended premiere. The more Eli dug, the more disturbing the story became. The Franklin Credit Union scandal, also known as the Franklin cover-up, involved allegations that went far beyond financial crimes. Multiple witnesses had testified under oath that children from troubled backgrounds, kids from foster homes, runaways, the forgotten and the vulnerable, had been trafficked to elite parties where they were abused by powerful men from the worlds of politics, business and intelligence agencies. The official investigation had collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Key witnesses died or disappeared. Evidence vanished, and the story was buried so thoroughly that most Americans had never heard of it. But someone, somewhere, wanted Eli to know about it. Someone had risked sending him this tape, this breadcrumb trail into a decades-old conspiracy. The question was, why him? And more importantly, what were they trying to tell him? Eli's investigation began in the archives, public records, court documents, newspaper clippings from the late 1980s and early 1990s, anything he could find about the Franklin Credit Union and its director, Lawrence King. What he discovered was a story that seemed almost too bizarre to be true, and yet the documentation was there. hidden in plain sight in dusty file cabinets and forgotten databases. Lawrence King had been a rising star in Republican politics during the Reagan era, a black man who'd pulled himself up from poverty to become the director of the Franklin Credit Union. He was celebrated as a symbol of American opportunity. He sang the national anthem at Republican national conventions, had his picture taken with presidents, and was considered a rising political star. But beneath the surface, something far darker was happening. In 1988, the Franklin Credit Union collapsed, and King was accused of embezzling millions of dollars. But the financial crimes were just the beginning. Multiple young people came forward with testimony that King had been running a child trafficking operation, flying minors on private planes to elite parties in Washington, D.C., Colorado, and California. The testimony was specific, detailed, and deeply disturbing. Paul Bonacci, one of the primary witnesses, described being taken to parties where he was abused by men he later identified as prominent politicians and businessmen. He spoke of being forced to participate in disturbing rituals, of being filmed during abuse, and of being threatened with death if he ever spoke about what he'd witnessed. Another witness, Alicia Owen, corroborated Bonacci's testimony and added her own horrific details. She described being taken to a ranch in Colorado where children were abused for the entertainment of wealthy men, and of being forced to recruit other vulnerable young people into the network. But instead of triggering a massive federal investigation, the testimony was dismissed as fantasy. Alicia Owen was convicted of perjury and sentenced to 25 years in prison, a longer sentence than any of the men she'd accused. Paul Bonacci was institutionalized and heavily medicated. The message was clear: speak out against powerful people, and you'll be destroyed. Even more disturbing were the mysterious deaths that surrounded the case. Gary Caradori, a private investigator hired by the Nebraska legislature to look into the allegations, died in a suspicious plane crash in 1990. He'd called his wife just hours before the crash, telling her he'd found evidence that would blow the lid off the case. His briefcase, which witnesses said he never travelled without, was never found in the wreckage. Troy Boner, another young witness who initially corroborated the trafficking allegations, suddenly recanted his testimony. Years later, he would tell investigators that he'd been threatened and coerced into changing his story. He died of unknown causes in 2003, alone and forgotten. As Eli compiled these files, a pattern began to emerge. This wasn't just about one man or one credit union. The testimony suggested a network, a systematic operation that used vulnerable children as currency in a high-stakes blackmail scheme. Children were abused not just for the gratification of their abusers, but to create compromising material that could be used to control powerful people. The implications were staggering. If the witnesses were telling the truth, then some of the most powerful people in American politics and business were being controlled by a shadowy network that used child abuse as its primary tool of leverage. And that network had the power to silence witnesses, destroy evidence, and manipulate the justice system itself. But who were the puppet masters? Who was running this network, and how deep did it go? Eli knew he needed to go to Omaha, to walk the ground where it all began, and to find the people who still remembered what really happened in those dark years of the late 1980s. Omaha in November was a city of grey skies and bare trees, where the prairie wind cut through your coat and seemed to carry whispers of forgotten secrets. Eli had managed to track down Janice Weller, a former reporter for the Omaha World Herald, who had covered the Franklin scandal before disappearing from journalism entirely in 1994. Finding her had taken weeks of detective work. She'd vanished from public view after the trials, her byline disappearing from newspapers, her social media presence non-existent. But Eli eventually tracked her to a small house on the outskirts of Omaha, where she lived alone with 3 cats and a cellar full of secrets. Janice was in her 60s now, with grey hair and suspicious eyes that seemed to be constantly looking over her shoulder. She'd agreed to meet with Eli only after he mentioned the VHS tape, and even then she insisted they talk in her basement, away from windows and prying ears. "I should have thrown all this away years ago," she said, gesturing to the boxes of files that lined the cellar walls. "But I couldn't. Someone needs to remember what really happened. even if they'll never let the truth come out. The files were a treasure trove of suppressed evidence, crime scene photos that had never been released to the public, witness statements that had been sealed by court order, financial records showing payments to what appeared to be shell companies, and most disturbing of all, a guest list to something called the Midnight Room, hosted in a converted Masonic lodge in 1987. The names on the list were a who's who of Nebraska politics and business, but they were joined by names from Washington, D.C., including several that Eli recognised as prominent politicians and at least one federal judge. Next to each name was a notation, confirmed, pending, or blacklisted. They weren't parties, Janice explained, her voice barely above a whisper. They were auctions. Children were brought in, displayed, and selected. The whole thing was filmed, supposedly for security, but really for leverage. Once you were on those tapes, you belonged to them. Among the files was a handwritten memo that made Eli's blood run cold. C1 clearance approved for Shadowbox, post-flight debrief required. It was signed with initials he didn't recognise, but the letterhead was unmistakable, Central Intelligence Agency. The Franklin Credit Union was just the money laundering operation, Janice continued. The real network was much bigger, international. They were trafficking children not just for abuse, but for intelligence purposes, creating compromising material on foreign leaders, business executives, anyone who might be useful to control. She showed him photographs that had been stored in sealed envelopes for 30 years. Children, some as young as 8 or 9, standing next to men whose faces had been carefully blacked out with ink. But in some photos the ink had faded or been applied carelessly, revealing partial faces that Eli recognised from newspaper photos and television appearances. I tried to publish this, Janice said. In 1993 I had a story ready to go. Names, dates, evidence. My editor killed it. Said it was too dangerous, that we didn't have enough corroboration. The next week I found a dead cat on my doorstep with a note. Curiosity killed the cat. Why didn't you take it to another paper? Janice laughed bitterly. I tried. Every major newspaper in the country. They all said the same thing. Not enough evidence, too controversial. Couldn't verify the sources. But I knew what was really happening. Phone calls were being made. Pressure was being applied. The story was being killed at the highest levels. As they talked deep into the night, Janice's paranoia became more understandable. She told him about cars that followed her home, about phone calls where no one spoke, about former colleagues who suddenly wouldn't return her calls. In 1994, after the documentary Conspiracy of Silence was pulled from broadcast, she'd received a final warning. A man came to my house, she said. Professional, polite, said he was with the government, though he never showed identification. He told me that my investigation was threatening national security, that there were ongoing intelligence operations that could be compromised. He said if I continued asking questions, I would be considered a threat to those operations. And you stopped. I had a daughter, Janice said simply. She was 15. He showed me photos of her walking to school, sitting in the library, getting on the school bus. Never threatened her directly, but the message was clear. That night, Eli lay awake in his motel room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything Janice had told him. The scope of the conspiracy was almost incomprehensible. Not just abuse, but systematic exploitation of children for intelligence purposes. Not just local corruption, but a network that reached into the highest levels of government. Around 3 a.m. he heard a soft scratching at his door. When he looked through the peephole, he saw nothing but empty hallway. But when he opened the door, there was an envelope on the floor. Inside, in the same careful block letters as the original VHS tape, was a simple message. Leave Omaha. This is your only warning. Despite the warning, or perhaps because of it, Eli couldn't let the story go. He'd come too far, learned too much to simply walk away. But he knew he needed more than Janice's files and his own investigation. He needed to find the people who had made the documentary Conspiracy of Silence, the film that had been pulled from broadcast just days before it was supposed to expose the Franklin scandal to the world. It took 3 weeks of international phone calls and internet sleuthing, but Eli finally tracked down Edgar Kelson, the British documentary filmmaker who had been the primary editor on Conspiracy of Silence. Kelson was living in retirement in a small town outside London, and he was initially reluctant to talk about what he still considered the most disturbing project of his career. "We thought we were making a documentary about financial fraud," Kelson explained during their Skype conversation. "Bank director embezzles money, lives high life, gets caught. Standard corruption story. But as we dug deeper, as we interviewed more witnesses, we realised we'd stumbled into something much darker. The documentary team had spent months interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence and corroborating the most explosive allegations. They'd spoken with Paul Bonacci, Alicia Owen, and dozens of other young people who claimed to have been trafficked by the network. They'd obtained flight records showing private planes travelling between Omaha and Washington, D.C. They'd even managed to interview several of the accused men, though those interviews had been evasive and lawyered up. The evidence was overwhelming, Kelson said. We had testimony, documents, photographs. We'd corroborated details across multiple witnesses who had never spoken to each other. This wasn't fantasy or false memory syndrome. This was real. The documentary was completed in early 1994 and scheduled to air on the Discovery Channel. Promotional materials were printed, TV guide listings were published, and the filmmakers prepared for what they hoped would be a groundbreaking exposé that would finally bring justice to the Franklin victims. Then, just 5 days before the scheduled broadcast, everything fell apart. "I got a call from Discovery's lawyers," Kelson recalled. "They said there had been concerns raised about the documentary's content, that they needed to review it again before broadcast. Then another call saying the review would take several weeks. Then another saying the documentary was being pulled indefinitely." But the pressure wasn't just coming from the network. Kelson and his team began receiving threats, not the usual angry viewer complaints, but professional intimidation that seemed designed to make them disappear entirely. "My daughter was followed home from school," Kelson said, his voice growing quiet. "My wife's car was vandalised with a very specific message. Drop the Franklin story or we'll drop you. These weren't random cranks. These were people with resources, people who knew how to apply pressure." The final blow came when Kelson was approached by two men who claimed to be with British intelligence. They told him that the documentary was interfering with ongoing international intelligence operations, that broadcasting it would compromise sources and methods, and that continuing to pursue the story would be considered an act against national security. "They didn't say we couldn't make the documentary," Kelson explained. "They said if we aired it, we'd never see our children again. Not exactly a subtle threat." But Kelson had kept copies of the interviews, and he agreed to share some of the never-before-seen footage with Eli. The most disturbing interview was with a man named Troy Williams, who claimed to have been both a victim of the network and later one of its enforcers. Williams described being recruited into the network as a teenager, initially as a victim, but gradually being groomed to help recruit other children. He spoke of ritual parties, where children were drugged and abused while being filmed, creating what he called insurance policies against powerful men. "They let you think you're part of it," Williams said in the grainy footage. "They give you money, drugs, tell you you're special, but you're never really on the inside. You're just another asset, another tool. And the moment you try to leave, the moment you think about talking, they remind you what happens to people who cross them." Williams had died in 1997, officially of a drug overdose, though he'd been clean for 3 years according to people who knew him. His death was just another in the long list of mysterious fatalities that seemed to follow anyone who spoke out about the Franklin network. "The documentary industry is small," Kelson told Eli. "Word gets around about which stories you can't tell, which people you can't investigate. Franklin became one of those untouchable subjects. Not officially banned, just understood to be off limits if you wanted to keep working." As their conversation ended, Kelson offered Eli a final piece of advice. "Be very careful who you trust with this story. The network didn't disappear when Franklin was covered up. It just went deeper underground. And they're still watching for people who ask too many questions." 3 days after his conversation with Edgar Kelson, Eli received a message on a burner phone he'd bought specifically for the Franklin investigation. The text was simple. "He'll talk. Meet us behind the old Black Elk Lodge. Come alone." The Black Elk Lodge was on the outskirts of Omaha, a rundown building that had once hosted Native American cultural events, but had been abandoned for years. Eli almost didn't go. Every instinct told him it was a trap, a way to silence him like so many others who had gotten too close to the truth. But his journalistic curiosity won out over his survival instincts. He drove to the lodge as the sun was setting, parking behind the building where a single figure waited in the shadows. The man introduced himself as Nathan Cross, and Eli recognized him immediately from one of Janice Weller's photographs, one of those haunting images of children standing next to powerful men, though in Nathan's case the man's face hadn't been completely obscured. Even as a child, Nathan's eyes had held a hollow, traumatized look that spoke of horrors no child should endure. Now in his 40s, Nathan was soft-spoken but alert, constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting danger to emerge from the abandoned buildings around them. He'd agreed to meet with Eli, he said, because he knew his time was running out. "They never really let you go," Nathan explained. "Even after the trials, even after the official investigation ended, they kept tabs on everyone who knew too much. New identities, witness protection, relocation. None of it mattered. They always knew where we were." Nathan had been placed in foster care as a young child after his mother died of a drug overdose, and his father abandoned him. He was 8 years old when he was first taken to what the network called special parties, events that were described to the children as exclusive gatherings where they would meet important people who might help their futures. They were very careful about how they presented it, Nathan said. Made it seem like an honour, like we were being chosen for something special. They gave us nice clothes, taught us how to behave around important people, made us feel valuable for the first time in our lives. The parties were held in various locations, private homes, hotel suites, remote lodges, and even government buildings. The children were told they were there to provide companionship to lonely, powerful men, to be good listeners and show appreciation for the opportunities they were being given. But the reality was far darker. Nathan described being systematically abused by men he would later recognise as senators, governors, federal judges, and high-ranking military officers. The abuse was always filmed, supposedly for security purposes, but Nathan came to understand that the recordings were really about creating leverage. They didn't just abuse us for their own gratification, Nathan explained. They were creating a library of blackmail material. Anyone who attended those parties, anyone who participated was being recorded, and once you were on those tapes, you belonged to the network. The operation was more sophisticated than simple abuse. Children were coached on how to elicit admissions from their abusers, how to get them to discuss sensitive political or business matters while they were in compromising positions. The network wasn't just trafficking children. They were running an intelligence operation that used child abuse as its primary tool. Some of the men tried to resist at first, Nathan said. They'd be invited to parties, not knowing what they were really about, but once they were there, once they were filmed, they had no choice but to cooperate. The network had them completely. Nathan described a facility he called the Red Room, located in what appeared to be a repurposed Cold War-era fallout shelter in Maryland. This was where the most valuable recordings were stored, along with detailed files on everyone who had been compromised by the network. It wasn't just Americans, Nathan said. They brought in foreign diplomats, business leaders from other countries, anyone who might be useful to control. The operation was international, with tentacles reaching into governments around the world. As Nathan spoke, Eli began to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about child abuse or even political corruption. This was about a shadow network that used the systematic abuse of children to control key figures in government, business, and international affairs. It was intelligence work at its most horrific and effective. "Why are you talking to me now?" Eli asked. "After all these years of staying hidden?" Nathan's smile was sad and resigned. "Because I know I'm already dead. 3 other survivors from my group have died in the past 2 years. Car accidents, suicides, sudden illnesses. They're cleaning house, tying up loose ends. I figure I have maybe weeks before they get to me. Then why risk it? Why not just disappear?" "Because someone needs to tell the truth," Nathan said. "These children, we were thrown away, forgotten, treated like we didn't matter. But we did matter. We were human beings, and what happened to us was real. I want the truth to outlive me, even if I can't." As their conversation ended, Nathan handed Eli a small package. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a partial list of names. People who had been compromised by the network, people who were still being controlled decades later. "Be careful who you trust," Nathan warned as they parted ways. "The network still exists, just deeper underground, and they have people everywhere. Media, law enforcement, government. They'll know you're investigating long before you know they're watching." That was the last time anyone saw Nathan Cross alive. His body was found 3 weeks later in a hotel room in Denver, apparently having died of a heroin overdose. The official report noted that he had no history of drug use, but the case was quickly closed and forgotten. Eli Mercer's editor, Sarah Chen, began to worry when she hadn't heard from him in over 2 weeks. He'd been filing regular updates on his Franklin investigation, sending encrypted emails with documents and interview transcripts. But then the communication stopped, and her calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. The last message she'd received from him was a corrupted voice memo, recorded on what sounded like a cheap handheld device. The audio was broken and distorted, but she could make out fragments of what Eli was saying. "Sarah, if you're hearing this, saw the tapes. Not just what we thought. They weren't just governors and CEOs, intel guys. One wore a CIA pin. Same face from the Bohemian Grove group photo. They knew I was there. Think they let me walk out because they want to see who else I'll talk to." The message cut off there, replaced by static and electronic interference that hurt to listen to. Sarah tried everything she could think of to locate Eli. She called hospitals, police departments, and even reached out to his few remaining contacts in the journalism world. No one had seen him, no one had heard from him, and his credit cards hadn't been used in weeks. She filed a missing persons report, but the police seemed oddly uninterested in the case. The detective assigned to investigate suggested that Eli had probably just needed to get away, that freelance journalists sometimes disappeared for a while when they were working on sensitive stories. When Sarah mentioned the Franklin investigation, the detective's demeanour shifted noticeably. "Mum, you need to understand that your friend was chasing conspiracy theories," the detective said. "The Franklin thing was investigated thoroughly back in the 90s. It was all debunked. Sometimes people get so caught up in these stories that they lose perspective on reality." But Sarah knew Eli, and she knew he wasn't the type to get caught up in unfounded theories. He was methodical, careful, always corroborating his sources. If he said he'd found evidence of an ongoing conspiracy, then he'd found something real. 3 months after Eli's disappearance, Sarah received an anonymous package in the mail. Inside were photocopies of some of Eli's notes, along with a flash drive containing audio files and scanned documents. There was no letter, no explanation, just the raw materials of an investigation that had apparently gotten too close to dangerous truths. Sarah tried to interest mainstream media outlets in the story, but she encountered the same resistance that had buried the Franklin scandal 30 years earlier. Editors were polite but firm, not enough corroboration, too conspiracy-focused, not the kind of story their publications could support. She finally posted some of Eli's findings on a small conspiracy forum, hoping that someone would pick up the investigation where he'd left off. The posts generated significant interest and discussion, but they were quickly removed by forum moderators. When Sarah tried to repost them, she found her account had been banned. The final trace of Eli Mercer's investigation came in the form of a single quote that appeared on several conspiracy websites before being scrubbed from the internet entirely. No one knew who had posted it, or how it had survived long enough to be screenshot and shared, but it seemed to capture the essence of everything Eli had discovered. If power protects evil, then telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. The quote was attributed to E.M., investigative journalist, disappeared 2019 while investigating elite trafficking networks. But even those references began disappearing from search engines as if someone was working systematically to erase any trace of Eli's work. Sarah kept copies of everything: Eli's notes, the audio files, the documents he'd gathered. She stored them in safe deposit boxes, gave copies to trusted friends, and created digital backups in multiple locations. She was determined that Eli's investigation wouldn't die with him. But as the months passed, Sarah began to understand why so many people had been unwilling to pursue this story. She started noticing cars that seemed to follow her home from work. She received phone calls where no one spoke, just silence and then a hang-up. Her computer was hacked twice, though nothing seemed to be stolen. The message was clear. Drop the Franklin investigation, forget about Eli Mercer and move on with your life. For the sake of her own safety and that of her family, Sarah eventually did just that. But the truth, as Eli had learned, has a way of surviving even when the truth-tellers don't. His investigation lived on in fragments, copies of documents shared in encrypted emails, audio files passed between amateur investigators, testimonies that refused to be completely silenced. The Whisper Network, as Eli had come to call it, continued to operate in the shadows. But thanks to his work and the work of other investigators who had paid the ultimate price for their curiosity, the whispers were getting louder. The truth was becoming harder to bury. And somewhere, in safe deposit boxes and encrypted files, in the memories of survivors and the consciences of witnesses, the evidence waited. Waited for the right moment, the right person, the right opportunity to finally drag the darkness into the light. The Franklin Credit Union scandal may have been covered up, the witnesses silenced, and the documentary banned. But the truth, as they say, will out. And when it does, the revelations will shake the foundations of power structures that have operated in darkness for far too long. The children of Omaha deserve justice. The truth-tellers who died seeking it deserve to be remembered. And the network that destroyed so many lives deserve to be exposed, no matter how long it takes, no matter how dangerous the investigation becomes. Because as Eli Mercer learned in his final weeks, some stories are too important to remain buried. Some truths are too powerful to be silenced forever. And some conspiracies are too evil to survive the light of day. The Whisper Network thought they had won. They thought they had buried the truth along with the truth-tellers. They were wrong. The investigation continues, even now, carried forward by people who refuse to let the darkness triumph. And one day, the whispers will become shouts, the fragments will become a complete picture, and the network that has operated in shadow for so long will finally face the light. Until then, we remember, we investigate, we whisper the truth to anyone who will listen, and we never ever stop asking questions. Tonight, we're travelling to Northern California, to the shadow of a mountain that may be more than it appears. This is the story of J.C. Brown, a man who claimed to have found something impossible beneath Mount Shasta, and who paid the ultimate price for speaking the truth. This is my story too, because sometimes when you dig deep enough into the past starts digging back. My name is Dr. Rowan Hensley, and what you're about to hear may be the last recording I ever make. I wasn't always a believer in conspiracies. 3 years ago, I was Dr. Rowan Hensley, Associate Professor of Geological Sciences at UC Davis, specialising in volcanic formations and seismic activity. I published papers on magma chamber dynamics, taught undergraduate courses on mineralogy, and lived a perfectly ordinary academic life. My biggest controversy was arguing with colleagues about the dating methods for certain lava flows. That changed on a rainy Thursday in November 2021, when I was conducting research at the San Francisco Public Library's Archive Division. I was looking for historical geological surveys of the Cascade Range when the librarian, Mrs. Chen, brought me a box of uncatalogued materials that had been donated by the estate of a deceased city employee. Most of it was routine bureaucratic paperwork from the 1930s and 40s, but at the bottom of the box, I found something that would reshape my understanding of everything I thought I knew about the world beneath our feet. It was a newspaper clipping, half burnt and water damaged, with a stamp across the top that read, "Geo-classified, redacted," in faded red ink. The visible portions of the article told an incredible story about a man named J.C. Brown who, in 1934, had gathered 80 people in Stockton, California, for what he called the most important archaeological expedition in human history. According to the fragmentary text, Brown claimed to have discovered a vast underground city beneath Mount Shasta, filled with golden artifacts, strange hieroglyphs, and the preserved remains of giants. The expedition was scheduled to depart on June 19th, 1934, but on the morning of departure, J.C. Brown had vanished without a trace. The expedition never happened. Brown was never seen again. What captured my attention wasn't just the fantastic nature of Brown's claims, but the official stamp on the clipping. Why would a newspaper article about what seemed like obvious fraud require geological classification? Why the redaction stamp? And why had it survived in a city employee's personal effects for nearly a century? I spent the next 6 months researching everything I could find about J.C. Brown. The official story, as recorded in historical societies and newspaper archives, was frustratingly simple. Brown was a drifter, possibly mentally ill, who had concocted an elaborate hoax to separate gullible people from their money. When the time came to deliver on his promises, he disappeared rather than face exposure as a fraud. But the more I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. Brown wasn't some uneducated con man. Records showed he had worked as a geological surveyor for the Lord Cowdray Mining Company, a legitimate British firm with contracts throughout the American West. In 1904, he had been part of a team conducting mineral assessments in the Mount Shasta region, when he disappeared for several weeks. When Brown reappeared, his colleagues noted that he seemed changed. He was reluctant to discuss where he had been, spoke often about ancient civilizations, and had acquired an unusual collection of what he claimed were pre-Columbian artifacts that didn't match any known Native American cultures. More intriguingly, I found references to Brown in the correspondence files of several prominent geologists and archaeologists of the era. These weren't dismissive letters mocking an obvious fraud, but serious inquiries about his discoveries. Dr. Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard's Peabody Museum had written to Brown requesting detailed sketches of the hieroglyphs he claimed to have found. The Smithsonian had expressed interest in examining his artifacts. These were serious academics taking Brown seriously, which didn't align with the historical narrative of him as a delusional hoaxer. The breakthrough came when I discovered that the Lord Cowdray Mining Company had been purchased by a consortium of American investors in 1911, and their records had been transferred to the National Archives. Using my academic credentials, I was able to access Brown's employment file. What I found there changed everything. Brown's official title wasn't just geological surveyor. He was listed as a special projects contractor with security clearance for what was euphemistically called federal land assessment. His supervisor's notes mentioned Brown's expertise in subsurface anomaly identification and his assignment to deep reconnaissance projects. This wasn't the profile of a wandering prospector or delusional fraud. This was a man with government connections, working on classified projects in some of America's most remote locations. The file ended abruptly in 1912 with a single notation: subject transferred to Division C oversight. Further records sealed pending national security review. Division C. I had never heard of any Division C within the US Geological Survey, but the notation suggested it was some kind of specialized unit dealing with sensitive discoveries. I spent weeks trying to find any reference to Division C in official records, but it was as if the organization had never existed. That's when I realized I needed help from someone with experience navigating the darker corners of government secrecy. I needed someone who understood how information disappears and how to find what's been deliberately hidden. I needed Cassia Wren. Finding Cassia Wren wasn't easy. She had been a data analyst for the National Security Agency until 2018, when she became what the intelligence community politely calls a problem, after witnessing what she described as systematic suppression of anomalous intelligence. She had resigned her position and begun operating as what she called a dark archivist, someone who specializes in recovering information that powerful organizations prefer to keep buried. Cassia operated through encrypted channels and dead drops, paranoid but not without reason. Her former colleagues had made it clear that her continued freedom depended on her maintaining a low profile and avoiding certain sensitive subjects. but when I reached out through the appropriate channels, explaining my research into J.C. Brown and Division C, she agreed to meet. We met at a 24-hour diner in Modesto, California, chosen because it was exactly halfway between our locations and because, as Cassia explained, the acoustics make electronic surveillance difficult, and the clientele is too distracted by their own problems to pay attention to ours. Cassia was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the intense focus of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. She listened to my story about J.C. Brown without interruption, occasionally taking notes in what appeared to be her own shorthand system. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with deliberate precision. "Division C," she finally said. "I've heard whispers about that designation, but never in connection with the Geological Survey. In my experience, when government agencies create subdivisions that don't officially exist, it's because they're dealing with phenomena that don't officially exist either." She explained that during her time at the NSA, she had occasionally encountered references to what intelligence analysts called anomalous archaeology, discoveries that couldn't be explained within conventional historical frameworks, and that had been classified to prevent public panic or international complications. "The standard protocol," she said, "is to classify the discovery, relocate or destroy the evidence, and discredit or neutralize anyone with direct knowledge. If J.C. Brown really found something significant under Mount Shasta, his disappearance wasn't mysterious. It was inevitable." Cassia agreed to help me investigate, but first she suggested we try to find more direct evidence of Brown's discoveries. She had a contact in Stockton who specialised in genealogical research and might be able to connect us with descendants of the people who had signed up for Brown's 1934 expedition. 3 days later, we were standing on the porch of a modest house in Stockton, talking to Emmett Kearney, a retired auto mechanic whose grandfather had been one of the 80 people prepared to follow J.C. Brown into Mount Shasta. Emmett was in his 70s, with the careful manner of someone who had spent his life being told that his family stories were too strange to be true. His grandfather, Patrick Kearney, had been a mining foreman who had known Brown during his work with the Lord Cowdray Company. Grandpa always said Brown was different after he came back from that survey in 1904, Emmett told us, leading us into his living room. Said he'd found something that changed his whole understanding of the world. Not gold or silver or anything like that. Something older. Emmett disappeared into a back room and returned with a metal box that had clearly been stored carefully for decades. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellow with age but still readable. "This belonged to J.C. Brown," Emmett said. "He gave it to my grandfather the night before he disappeared, told him to keep it safe and only show it to someone who would understand what it meant." The notebook was extraordinary. Page after page of detailed sketches showing complex tunnel systems, architectural diagrams of underground chambers, and copies of symbols that looked like no writing system I had ever encountered. Some resembled cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, but others were completely alien. Geometric patterns and flowing scripts that seemed to shift and change as you looked at them. But it was Brown's written notes that were most disturbing. Scattered throughout the sketches were observations and warnings that painted a picture of something far stranger than a simple archaeological discovery. The passages extend far deeper than any natural cave system. The stone is carved, not eroded. Someone built this. Found the chamber of the tall ones today. 12 skeletons, each nearly 8 feet in height. The bone structure is wrong. Too many vertebrae. Skull proportions unlike any human remains. The symbols on the walls seem to respond to light. When I shine my lamp directly on them, they appear to glow faintly. Must investigate further. Discovery of what can only be described as a throne room. Central seat carved from single block of unknown black stone. Hieroglyphs cover every surface. Translation attempts unsuccessful, but recurring motifs suggest astronomical significance. Warning: not all stone here is dead. Some sections of wall feel warm to the touch and seem to pulse with internal rhythm. Recommend extreme caution in future explorations. They wake to light. The guardians stir when exposed to illumination. Natural darkness keeps them dormant, essential to maintain absolute silence and minimal lighting. Guardian class was mentioned repeatedly, always in capital letters, as if it were an official designation. Brown wrote about discovering what he called the Watchers, humanoid figures carved from stone or possibly preserved through unknown means, positioned at regular intervals throughout the deeper tunnels. Most unsettling was an entry dated just days before Brown's disappearance. Contact established with surface oversight, Division C protocols now in effect. Further documentation restricted pending security review. If something happens to me, let it be known that what lies beneath Shasta was not built by any human civilization. The final page contained only a signature. J.C. Brown, Senior Field Specialist, Division C, U.S., G.S., Black Registry. Cassia examined the notebook with the careful attention of someone trained in document analysis. The paper is consistent with 1930s manufacture, she said. The ink shows appropriate aging patterns. If this is a fake, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated one. She photographed every page while I tried to process what we had discovered. This wasn't the journal of a delusional fraud or opportunistic con man. This was the careful documentation of someone who had found something genuinely extraordinary and who understood the implications of his discovery. Brown hadn't disappeared because he was a fraud. He had disappeared because he was telling the truth. Back at her secure workspace, Cassia began the delicate process of penetrating government databases to find any trace of Division C or J.C. Brown's final fate. This wasn't simple hacking. It was digital archaeology, requiring an understanding of how classification systems had evolved over the decades and where sensitive information might have been buried or relocated. The problem with secrets, Cassia explained as she worked, isn't keeping them hidden initially. It's maintaining that secrecy across decades of bureaucratic changes, technological upgrades, and personnel turnover. Something always slips through the cracks. She started with the National Archives, cross-referencing personnel records, budget allocations, and interdepartmental communications from the 1930s. Most government divisions, even classified ones, leave paper trails, expense reports, salary payments, equipment requisitions. Division C, however, seemed to have existed in a bureaucratic void. No official budget, no personnel records, no equipment purchases. Either it had never existed, or someone had been extraordinarily thorough in erasing its traces. That level of erasure is almost more suspicious than finding classified records, Cassia said. It takes significant resources and ongoing effort to make something disappear this completely from government archives. Whatever Division C was doing, someone very powerful wanted it forgotten. She switched tactics, focusing on individual names rather than organisational records. If J.C. Brown had been eliminated by government agents, there should be some trace of the operation. Travel vouchers, communication records, incident reports. It took 3 days of careful searching, but she finally found it buried in the administrative files of the Department of Interior, a single line item in a 1934 budget reconciliation document that read, Shasta 71. Unauthorized excavation suppressed, just personnel issues resolved, $847.50. $847.50, the cost of making J.C. Brown disappear. Further searching revealed additional fragments. A memo from the Bureau of Land Management dated June 20th, 1934, one day after Brown's disappearance, requesting indefinite closure of specified access routes to Mount Shasta pending geological assessment. A requisition for specialised excavation equipment charged to an unspecified clean-up operation. A communication from the War Department authorising temporary personnel assignment for domestic security issue. The picture that emerged was of a coordinated operation to suppress Brown's discoveries and eliminate him as a security threat. But the fragmentary nature of the record suggested something even more disturbing. This wasn't a one-time event, but part of an ongoing program. Cassia found references to similar operations. Yellowstone 23, Archaeological Anomaly Contained, Crater Lake 15, Unauthorized Documentation Recovered, Grand Canyon 41, Research Team Relocated. They've been doing this for decades, she said, her voice quiet with the weight of the realization. Every time someone finds something that doesn't fit the official narrative, they step in. discredit the discoverer, confiscate the evidence, and bury the whole thing under layers of classification and misdirection. But the most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. While searching through declassified CIA documents from the 1970s, Cassia found a brief mention of something called the Shasta Protocol in a memo discussing domestic surveillance operations. The memo was heavily redacted, but the visible portions referred to ongoing monitoring of fringe researchers investigating pre-authorized archaeological sites and established procedures for managing information security breaches related to subterranean anomalies. The Shasta Protocol wasn't just about J.C. Brown. It was an active program designed to suppress any investigation into what lay beneath Mount Shasta, and by extension, other locations where similar discoveries had been made. "We need to be very careful," Cassia warned as we reviewed the documents. "If this protocol is still active, they know we're investigating. They've been watching for people like us for 90 years. But I was past the point of caution. J.C. Brown had been murdered for trying to reveal the truth, and dozens of other researchers had likely suffered the same fate. The scope of the cover-up suggested something far more significant than a simple archaeological anomaly. I wanted to see what they were so desperate to hide. I wanted to go to Mount Shasta. Cassia tried to dissuade me. She understood better than I did the risks we were taking by continuing the investigation, but she also understood that some truths are too important to remain buried, regardless of the personal cost. We spent 2 weeks preparing for what we knew might be our final collaboration. Cassia assembled specialized equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, ground-penetrating radar, cameras capable of functioning in absolute darkness, and communication devices that could operate without cellular or satellite connections. Using J.C. Brown's sketches and topographical maps from the 1930s, we identified what appeared to be the entrance he had used, a lava tube system on the northeastern slope of Mount Shasta, accessible through what locals called the Devil's Kitchen, a collection of volcanic vents and steam deposits. We left for Mount Shasta on a Thursday morning in October, telling no one our destination or timeline. If something happened to us, Cassia had arranged for copies of our research to be automatically released to several journalists and researchers, but we both understood that our safety depended on completing the investigation quickly and quietly. The approach to the lava tubes was more difficult than Brown's notes had suggested, requiring several hours of hiking through dense forest and over loose volcanic rock. The tubes themselves were exactly where his sketches indicated, but the entrance had been partially collapsed, either by natural causes or deliberate sabotage. It took most of the day to clear enough debris to allow access, but by evening we were standing at the mouth of a passage that descended into absolute darkness beneath Mount Shasta. The initial descent was routine. The lava tube was similar to others I had explored in my academic career: rough volcanic glass walls, irregular floor surfaces, and the musty smell of stagnant air and mineral deposits. But after perhaps 200 feet, we encountered the first sign that this was no ordinary cave system. The walls changed. Instead of the random textures of cooled lava, we found smooth surfaces covered with carved symbols identical to those in Brown's notebook. The carvings were deep and precise, clearly the work of intelligent beings using sophisticated tools. "These aren't natural formations," I said, running my hands over the symbols. "Someone carved these, recently enough that they haven't been significantly weathered." Cassia's electromagnetic detector began registering unusual readings. "I'm getting energy signatures that don't match any known geological phenomena," she reported. "It's almost like the rock itself is generating some kind of field." We continued deeper, following Brown's map through a series of branching passages that led steadily downward. The air grew warmer as we descended, and the carved symbols became more elaborate and frequent. Some covered entire wall surfaces, depicting what appeared to be astronomical charts, anatomical diagrams, and scenes of robed figures performing unknown rituals. After nearly 2 hours of careful progress, we reached what Brown's notes had described as the first threshold, a circular chamber perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling covered in symbols that seemed to shimmer in our flashlight beams. "The symbols are reacting to our lights," Cassia whispered. "Look at them. They're actually glowing." She was right. As we moved our beams across the walls, the carved symbols briefly luminescent with a soft blue-green light that faded when we moved the light away. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in my geological career, but more disturbing were the alcoves carved into the walls at regular intervals. Each contained what appeared to be a humanoid figure, but whether they were statues, preserved bodies, or something else entirely was impossible to determine in the uncertain light. "The Guardian class," I said, remembering Brown's terminology. "These must be what he was writing about." We approached one of the figures cautiously. It was clearly humanoid, but wrong, in subtle ways that made it deeply unsettling to look at. Too tall, perhaps 7.5 feet in height. Limbs that were slightly too long in proportion to the torso. A skull that was elongated and narrow, with eye sockets that were larger and more deeply set than any human skull. The figure was clothed in what appeared to be robes or ceremonial garments made from some unknown material that had survived whatever preservation process had maintained the body. In its hands was a staff or rod covered with more of the glowing symbols. "Is it alive?" Cassia asked, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, her equipment began registering massive electromagnetic spikes. Every detector she carried was suddenly screaming warnings about energy levels far beyond anything we had expected to encounter. "We need to move," she said urgently. "Something is responding to our presence." Following Brown's map, we located the passage that led to what his notes called the deep chambers. The tunnel was narrower than those we had traversed earlier, requiring us to proceed single file through passages that seemed to pulse with the same blue-green luminescence we had observed in the symbols. The air itself felt different here, thicker, almost alive with some kind of energy that made our skin tingle and our equipment malfunction. Cassia's electromagnetic detectors were giving readings so far outside normal parameters that she finally shut them off to prevent the alarms from echoing through the tunnels. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes of careful progress, we emerged into a chamber that defied easy description. It was vast, easily the size of a cathedral, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our lights. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with the most elaborate symbol systems we had yet encountered, arranged in patterns that suggested complex mathematical or astronomical calculations. But dominating the centre of the chamber was what Brown had described as the throne of the Deep King. It was carved from a single block of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The chair itself was enormous, clearly designed for someone much larger than any human being. Seated upon it was a figure that dwarfed even the Guardian-class entities we had encountered above. This being was nearly 12 feet tall, with limb proportions and skeletal structure that were clearly non-human. The skull was elongated to an extreme degree, with eye sockets that were deep caverns in the ancient bone. It was dressed in elaborate robes that had somehow survived whatever preservation process had maintained the body, and in its hands was a staff topped with what appeared to be a crystalline structure that pulsed with internal light. But most disturbing were the walls behind the throne. They were covered with what could only be described as a mural depicting the history of the world, but not the history found in any textbook. The images showed an Earth much different from the one we knew. Continents in different configurations, skies filled with celestial bodies that were not the sun and moon we recognized, and beings that were clearly not human, living in vast cities that spanned continents. One section of the mural showed what appeared to be a massive catastrophe. Fires falling from the sky, oceans boiling, mountains cracking open to release torrents of lava and ash. In the aftermath, the surviving beings were shown retreating underground, sealing themselves away in deep chambers to wait for the surface world to become habitable again. The final panel showed an eclipse, total darkness covering the earth, and from that darkness, strange vessels rising into the sky, carrying the ancient inhabitants away to points of light that could only be stars. They weren't from here, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. These beings, whatever they weren't native to Earth. They were visitors, and when something happened to make the surface uninhabitable, they went underground to wait it out. But Cassia wasn't looking at the murals. She was staring at the seated figure on the throne, her face pale with terror. "It's breathing," she whispered. I looked more carefully at the massive form on the throne. At first I saw nothing, but then I noticed it. The slightest movement of the chest, so subtle it was barely perceptible. The ancient being wasn't dead, it was sleeping. As if responding to our realization, the crystalline structure atop the being's staff began to pulse more rapidly, casting shifting patterns of light across the chamber walls. And then, without any warning, a voice filled our minds, not heard with our ears, but felt as a pressure inside our skulls. "You weren't meant to return." The voice was vast and alien, carrying with it implications of age and power that made my rational mind reel. This wasn't communication as humans understood it, but something far more direct and invasive. The seal weakens with each intrusion, the watchers stir, the deep paths remember the taste of surface light. Images flooded our consciousness, not memories, but something deeper and more fundamental. We saw the earth as these beings had known it, green and blue and alive with civilizations that had risen and fallen millions of years before the first human ancestors had descended from the trees. We saw the catastrophe that had driven them underground, not an asteroid impact or volcanic eruption, but something far stranger and more terrible. A darkness between the stars that had reached out to touch our world, twisting reality itself until the surface became uninhabitable for any thinking being. The compact was made, the deep places were sealed, the guardians were set to watch. Why do the surface dwellers return to break what was meant to remain broken? I tried to speak, to explain that we were researchers seeking knowledge, but my voice wouldn't function. The alien presence in our minds was too overwhelming, too vast for human consciousness to process. "J.C. Brown," Cassia managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to J.C. Brown?" The response came as a flood of images and sensations. We saw Brown in this very chamber, 30 years after his first discovery, brought here not by his own choice but by those who served the ancient powers. We saw him standing before the throne, defiant even in the face of forces beyond human comprehension. The Surface Guardian was given choice. Serve the compact or join the deep sleep. He chose defiance. He chose the fate of all who would wake what must remain sleeping. We saw Brown's final moments, not death, but transformation. His body changing, elongating, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. We saw him being placed in one of the alcoves we had passed, joining the Guardian-class entities that stood eternal watch over the deep chambers. The Shasta Protocol was created to prevent such defiance. Those who dig too deep join those they seek to disturb. The compact will be maintained. The voice was growing stronger, and with it came the sound of movement throughout the chamber complex. The other figures, the Guardian-class entities we had encountered, were stirring from their long vigil. "Run!" Cassia said, grabbing my arm. "We need to run now." We fled through the tunnels with the sound of pursuit echoing behind us. Not footsteps, but something worse, the scraping of stone against stone as beings that had been motionless for decades began to move. Our flashlights revealed glimpses of humanoid figures emerging from alcoves we had passed earlier, their elongated forms moving with predatory grace through passages they had navigated for countless years. The symbols on the walls were glowing brighter now, responding to the awakening of the Guardians. The entire tunnel system was coming alive, and we were trapped in the depths of something that had never been meant for human exploration. We reached the surface after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes of desperate flight. The clean night air of Mount Shasta felt like salvation after the oppressive atmosphere of the deep chambers. But our relief was short-lived. 3 unmarked helicopters were circling the mountain, their searchlights cutting through the darkness as they systematically examined the forest below. As we emerged from the lava tube entrance, we were immediately caught in the brilliant glare of multiple spotlights. "Doctor," Rowan Hensley and Ms. Cassia Wren, a voice called through a loudspeaker, "you're in violation of federal regulations regarding restricted archaeological sites. Remain stationary and prepare for extraction." Military personnel rappelled from the helicopters with the practiced efficiency of a long-rehearsed operation. They were equipped with specialised gear, not just weapons, but electromagnetic field generators and what appeared to be sonic equipment designed to disrupt the kind of energies we had encountered below ground. "The Shasta Protocol," I said, finally understanding. "They've been waiting for us." Cassia was already reaching for the emergency transmitter she had brought to upload our findings to her secure servers, but before she could activate it, one of the soldiers fired what appeared to be a taser designed for electronic equipment. Every piece of technology we carried, cameras, recorders, communication devices, was instantly fried by the electromagnetic pulse. "Standard containment procedures," one of the soldiers said, his voice muffled by a full-face respirator. "No documentation, no evidence, no witnesses." They separated us immediately. The last thing I saw was Cassia being loaded into one helicopter, while I was forced into another. Through the aircraft's window, I watched Mount Shasta recede into the distance, its peak silhouetted against the stars like a monument to secrets that would never be told. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital room in Medford, Oregon, with no memory of how I had gotten there. According to the medical staff, I had been found unconscious on a hiking trail, apparently the victim of a fall that had resulted in a severe concussion and temporary amnesia. My personal effects had been returned to me, but everything related to our investigation was gone. J.C. Brown's notebook, our research files, the photographs Cassia had taken, all vanished as if they had never existed. The official story was that I had been conducting routine geological research when I suffered an accident. There was no mention of Cassia Wren, and when I tried to contact her through the channels we had established, I found that her entire digital presence had been scrubbed from the internet. Her dark archive website displayed only an error message. Her encrypted communication systems were offline. It was as if she had never existed. I returned to my position at UC Davis, but everything had changed. My research proposals were consistently rejected. My funding was cut. Colleagues who had previously sought my collaboration began avoiding me. The message was clear. I was to return to my routine academic work and forget everything that had happened. For 6 months I tried to comply. I taught my classes, published papers on safe topics like mineral formation and seismic activity, and attempted to convince myself that what we had experienced beneath Mount Shasta had been some kind of shared hallucination brought on by equipment malfunction and psychological stress. But late at night, when I closed my eyes, I could still see the throne room and its ancient occupant. I could still feel the alien presence that had spoken directly into our minds. I knew that somewhere beneath Mount Shasta, beings older than human civilization were stirring from their long sleep, and that our intrusion had weakened whatever barriers kept them contained. The breakthrough came in the form of a manila envelope slipped under my office door sometime during the night. Inside was a single page from J.C. Brown's notebook, one I had never seen before, apparently torn from the journal after we had examined it. The page was dated June 18th, 1934, 1 day before Brown's disappearance. In his careful handwriting he had written, "Final entry. They have found me. Division C has activated the containment protocol. I will not be permitted to complete the expedition or reveal what lies beneath the mountain, but I have taken precautions. Copies of my work have been hidden where they cannot be found and destroyed. Some day others will continue the investigation." To those who come after, I wasn't the first to find the city. The government has known about the deep places for decades, perhaps centuries. They have made agreements with the things below, compacts that trade human ignorance for temporary safety. But the barriers are weakening. The ancient ones grow restless. The deep paths are opening. They are not evil, but they are not human. Their return would mean the end of our world as we understand it. The Shasta Protocol exists to prevent that return, but it is built on lies and suppression rather than understanding and preparation. The truth must be preserved. Someone must bear witness. The mountain is not a mountain, it is a seal, and someone is trying to break it. The page was signed with an address I didn't recognize, a post office box in Anchorage, Alaska. I never made it to Alaska. 2 weeks after receiving the page, I disappeared from my office at UC Davis. The official story was that I had taken a leave of absence to deal with ongoing health issues related to my hiking accident. My colleagues were told that I would not be returning. The truth is more complex. I'm recording this from a location I cannot identify, surrounded by people who claim to be protectors of what they call the deep knowledge. Some are former government employees who became disillusioned with the Shasta Protocol. Others are researchers like myself who dug too deep and learned too much. We exist in the spaces between official reality and suppressed truth. We monitor the ancient sites, watch for signs that the barriers are weakening, and try to prepare for what may be coming. Because the being on the throne was right about one thing: the compact is failing. All across the world, in places like Mount Shasta, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and dozens of other locations, the deep places are stirring. The ancient ones are awakening from their long sleep, and when they fully emerge, the world we know will end. The Shasta Protocol was never about protecting us from the truth. It was about protecting the truth from us. Because sometimes, the truth is too dangerous for humanity to know. But perhaps it's time we learned anyway. This is Dr. Rowan Hensley making what may be my final recording. If you're hearing this, it means the automatic release protocols have been activated. It means something has happened to me, just as it happened to J.C. Brown and Cassia Wren and dozens of others who got too close to the deep secrets. Mount Shasta isn't a mountain, it's a seal, and after 90 years of suppression and cover-ups, that seal is beginning to crack. 3 days ago, seismic stations throughout Northern California registered unusual activity beneath Mount Shasta. Not earthquakes, something else. Rhythmic pulses emanating from deep underground, as if something massive was breathing, or waking up. Yesterday, hikers reported strange lights emanating from caves on the mountain's northeastern slope. Local authorities have cordoned off the area, citing geological instability, but we know better. The lights match descriptions from J.C. Brown's notebook. The deep chambers are active again, and tonight, at exactly 3:33 a.m. Pacific time, every seismic monitor within 100 miles of Mount Shasta went silent simultaneously. Not equipment failure, deliberate shutdown. Someone doesn't want the world to know what's happening beneath the mountain. But we're still watching, we're still recording. And when the time comes, and it's coming soon, someone needs to tell the truth about what lies beneath the places we call sacred, the mountains we think we know, and the ancient agreements that have kept horrors sleeping in the deep places of the earth. The Shasta Protocol is failing, the compact is broken, and something older than human civilization is stirring beneath the roots of the world. If you're listening to this, if you're out there somewhere in the darkness with your own questions about the world's hidden truths, remember this. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some doors should remain closed. Some secrets are too dangerous for daylight. But when those doors open anyway, when those secrets emerge despite all efforts to contain them, someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to remember what we were before everything changed. My name is Dr. Rowan Hensley. I was a geologist. I thought I understood the earth beneath our feet. I was wrong about everything. The mountain remembers. The deep places are calling, and somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, between human and something else entirely, J.C. Brown and all the others who dug too deep are waiting to welcome the next generation of truth-seekers to their eternal vigil. Don't look for me. Don't try to verify this story through official channels. Don't go to Mount Shasta. But if you do, if you can't resist the pull of forbidden knowledge, if you need to see for yourself what lies beneath, remember that some prices are paid not in money or blood, but in the fundamental nature of what it means to be human. The watchers are stirring, the guardians walk, the seal is breaking. And in the deep places beneath the mountain, something ancient and patient and utterly alien is opening eyes that have been closed since before the first human looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. We were never alone. We just weren't ready to meet our neighbours. End recording. Static. The following message was left on the voicemail system of the podcast Fringe Phenomena Weekly at 3:33 a.m. Pacific Time, 6 months after Dr. Hensley's disappearance. This was Dr. Rowan Hensley. If anyone receives this message, if anyone is still monitoring these frequencies, you need to know the Shasta Protocol has been terminated. All containment procedures have failed. The deep chambers are open. The ancient compact is void. They're not underground anymore. Last night something came out of Mount Shasta, something tall and wrong and older than human memory. It walked through the forest like it owned the world, like it was coming home after a long journey. The government response teams, they're not responding anymore. The helicopters fell out of the sky when they got too close. The soldiers, God, what it did to the soldiers. It's not just Shasta. We're getting reports from Yellowstone, from the Grand Canyon, from mountains and caves and deep places all over the world. They're all waking up. They're all coming back. The surface world belongs to them now. It always did. We were just keeping it warm. If you're listening to this, if you're still out there, don't try to fight them. Don't try to hide. They can sense human consciousness like we sense heat. They know where we are. Your only chance is to go deep. Find the old places, the sacred sites that were never meant for human worship. Look for the symbols that glow in the dark. Follow the passages that lead down instead of up. Join the Watchers. Become the Guardians. It's the only way to survive what's coming. The mountain was never a mountain. It was a doorway. And now that doorway is open. End transmission. The retired military satellite KH-14B hadn't been active for 3 years. Officially decommissioned after budget cuts forced the Pentagon to consolidate their orbital surveillance network. So when Nova Chen's custom frequency scanner picked up an encrypted data burst, routing through its dormant transponder at 3:47 a.m., she knew someone was playing with fire. "Lynx, you need to see this," she calls across the converted warehouse that serves as their operations centre. The space looks like a digital graveyard. Servers humming in stacks, screens casting blue light across walls covered in network diagrams and corporate org charts connected by red string. Welcome to the underground. Lynx Rodriguez slides his chair over, steam rising from his 4th cup of coffee. At 32, his face carries the weight of someone who's seen the machinery of power from the inside. Former NSA turned whistleblower turned ghost. What's the signature? Military-grade encryption, but it's using deprecated protocols. Whoever sent this wanted it to look old, forgotten. Nova's fingers dance across 3 keyboards simultaneously. But the timestamp is fresh. Someone's using dead satellites to hide active communications. Jax looks up from their corner workstation, purple hair catching the monitor glow. How fresh! 15 minutes ago. The warehouse falls silent except for the eternal hum of cooling fans. Professor Kale emerges from the makeshift lab in the back corner, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. At 58, he's the oldest member of their group, a disgraced virologist whose career ended when he asked too many questions about certain pandemic-era research protocols. "Did you crack it?" Kale asks, approaching with the careful steps of someone who's learned to expect bad news. Nova's screen fills with cascading code as her decryption algorithms chew through layers of obfuscation. Almost. There. The file materializes. Project Aegis 2030.enx. Aegis, Lynx mutters. That's not good. Aegis was a classified program I remember from my NSA days. Theoretical population management scenarios. Theoretical, Nova repeats, clicking open the file. Let's see how theoretical it still is. The document unfolds across her screen like a digital autopsy report. Code fragments, data tables, implementation timelines. Her eyes scan the contents, and her expression shifts from curiosity to confusion to something approaching horror. "Guys," she says, her voice dropping to a whisper, "this isn't about surveillance, this isn't about control." Jack spins their chair around. "What is it about?" Nova's hands tremble slightly as she highlights a section of code. Variables with names like fertility, reduction, vectors, genetic selection, protocols, and population ceiling enforcement. "It's about extinction," she breathes. "Mass vaccination campaigns, supply chain disruptions, climate-based selection zones." She reads directly from the screen. Phase implementation. Reduce global population to sustainable levels through coordinated biological and environmental interventions. Target timeline 2030. Acceptable retention rate 6 to 8% of current population. The silence stretches like a held breath. 6 to 8%, Kyle repeats slowly, of 7 billion people. "That's not population control," Link says, his intelligence training kicking in as he processes the implications. "That's genocide with a spreadsheet." Nova scrolls deeper into the document, her face pale in the monitor light. "There's more. Listen to this. This initiative represents a fundamental reset of the human species. Traditional methods of population management through war, famine, and disease have proven insufficient to address the accelerating resource depletion crisis. Project Aegis represents a coordinated approach to ensure species survival through selective reduction." "Species survival," Jax echoes. "They're talking about us like we're livestock." "No," Nova corrects, her voice hollow. "Livestock are valuable. We're weeds they want to clear from the garden." Kale sits down heavily, his scientific mind wrestling with the implications. During his years researching virology, he'd seen enough classified projects to know that the line between theoretical and operational could be crossed with a single authorization signature. "We need to verify this," he says finally. "Cross-reference with known programs, trace the source, build a complete picture. If this is real, Nova finishes, "we're looking at the greatest crime in human history, and it's already begun." Lynx pulls up his contacts, a carefully maintained network of sources still embedded in various intelligence agencies. "I'll reach out to my people, see what chatter I can pick up." "I'll dig into the technical specifications," Jax offers. "These code fragments reference specific biological agents. If they're using existing research, there'll be traces in academic databases." Nova saves the file to their secure server and begins setting up multiple backup protocols. "Professor, we need you to analyze the biological components. Your expertise might be the key to understanding how they plan to implement this." As the team disperses to their workstations, the weight of their discovery settles over the warehouse like digital smoke. They've stumbled across something that wasn't meant for human eyes, a blueprint for the end of the world as they know it. Outside, the city sleeps on, unaware that 4 people in a converted warehouse have just glimpsed the future, and it looks like a graveyard with Wi-Fi. Nova stares at the file name blinking on her screen, Project Aegis 2030.nc. In mythology, Aegis was the shield of Zeus, a divine protection for the gods. But protection for whom? And protection from what? As she begins her deep dive into the data, one phrase keeps echoing in her mind from the document's executive summary. This isn't about control, it's about resetting the species. The countdown, she realizes, isn't to some distant apocalypse. It's to tomorrow. 3 days of sleepless research have transformed their warehouse into a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Every wall now displays interconnected timelines, corporate hierarchies, and data flowcharts that would make a forensic accountant weep. Nova hasn't left the building since they cracked the Aegis file, surviving on instant ramen and the kind of caffeine-fueled determination that borders on religious fervour. "I found the breadcrumbs," she announces, her voice hoarse from exhaustion, and chain-smoking cigarettes she bummed from Lynx. The World Population Summit in Cairo, 1994. Most people remember it as a boring UN conference about reproductive rights and sustainable development. She pulls up archived documents on the main display screen, official transcripts, media reports, diplomatic cables, standard bureaucratic theatre. But look what happens when you dig into the closed-door sessions. A classified document appears, heavily redacted but with enough visible text to tell a story. The header reads, Adaptive Earth Framework, Preliminary Implementation Strategies. Cale adjusts his glasses, squinting at the screen. I remember this conference. I was a graduate student then, writing my dissertation on population genetics. There were rumours about private sessions, but nobody talked about what was discussed, Nova finishes. Except someone did. Deep in the diplomatic archives, buried under 17 layers of classification, I found this. She highlights passages that make the room's temperature seem to drop. Non-essential demographic drift must be addressed through coordinated intervention. Genetic dead zones present opportunity for selective resource allocation. Acceptable fallout parameters established at 85 to 90% reduction over 2-generation cycle. Project requires integration of medical, agricultural and environmental vectors. Jax looks up from their workstation, where they've been cross-referencing pharmaceutical patents. Nova, you need to see this. Those medical vectors they mention. I've been tracking the patent filings, and there's a pattern. They throw their research onto the shared screen. Dozens of pharmaceutical patents filed between 2018 and 2023, all connected to a web of shell companies, all related to mRNA modification technology. But here's the weird part, Jax continues. These patents aren't just for vaccines. They're for genetic modification systems that can be activated remotely, dormant until triggered by specific environmental factors. Cale's face goes pale. That's not possible. The technology to create delayed activation genetic modifications didn't exist in 2018, Jax agrees, but it does now. And according to these patents, it's been deployed. Nova pulls up another document from their Aegis cache. Remember, Professor, you mentioned seeing strange compounds in vaccine trials during the pandemic? Trials with non-public results? Cale nods slowly. There were inconsistencies. Control groups that should have shown specific immune responses but didn't. Novel proteins that had no apparent therapeutic function. When I raised concerns, you were discredited and forced out, Nova says. They called you a conspiracy theorist. Because I was asking the wrong questions, Cale realises. I was looking for immediate effects, but if these compounds were designed for delayed activation... Link slides his chair over, holding a printout of classified communications he's pulled from the old NSA databases. I've been digging through archived surveillance reports. Remember how during the pandemic, certain rural areas had unusually high vaccination rates, areas that normally resist federal health initiatives. He spreads out a map showing vaccination distribution patterns across the United States. Strange clusters appear in seemingly random locations. Rural counties in Montana, farming communities in Iowa, small towns along the Appalachian Trail. These aren't random, Nova says, studying the pattern. They're systematic. Someone was targeting specific populations. Or specific genetic profiles, Cale adds quietly. Jax's workstation chimes with an alert. Guys, I've been monitoring dark web chatter about unusual health trends. Look at this. They project a series of forum posts, social media reports, and medical anomalies from the past 6 months. Unexplained fertility drops in rural communities. Unusual autoimmune responses in adults aged 25 to 45. Regional variations in birth defects that don't match known environmental factors. Agricultural workers reporting mysterious illnesses that don't respond to standard treatments. Nova connects the dots on their shared display, drawing lines between vaccination sites, health anomalies, and demographic data. The pattern that emerges looks like a slow-motion biological weapon detonating across the landscape. They weren't just treating viruses, she says, echoing Cale's earlier words. They were treating the future human genome. Lynx pulls up another classified document, this one from a more recent surveillance operation. There's more. I found references to something called genetic compatibility mapping in Department of Homeland Security briefings. They've been collecting DNA samples through routine medical procedures and cross-referencing them with... He stops, staring at the screen. With what? Nova prompts. With survival probability models, he finishes. They're not just tracking who might survive their selective reduction. They're actively identifying who they want to eliminate. The warehouse falls silent as the implications settle over them like digital ash. They're not just looking at a conspiracy, they're looking at the implementation phase of humanity's final exam. And most of the class is about to fail. Kale stands up slowly, his scientific mind finally accepting what his moral instincts have been screaming. We need to understand the full scope. If they've weaponized the medical system, the agricultural system, the environmental monitoring system, then they've turned civilization itself into a weapon, Nova completes. As if summoned by their conversation, Jax's monitoring systems light up with alerts. Encrypted traffic spike on the satellite networks, same routing pattern as the original Aegis transmission. Nova rushes to her decryption station. They're talking again. If we can intercept this... The file downloads slowly, each percentage point feeling like an eternity. When it finally opens, it's not code this time. It's a video conference recording. Meeting minutes, Lynx realizes, from yesterday. Nova's hand hovers over the play button. Once they watch this, there's no going back. No pretending they stumbled across theoretical documents or academic exercises. Whatever's on this recording, she says, it's going to show us who's behind this, and what comes next. She clicks play. The screen fills with faces they recognise from news broadcasts and magazine covers. World leaders, tech billionaires, pharmaceutical executives, and scientists, all sitting around a virtual conference table discussing the end of the world with the casual tone of a quarterly earnings call. And in the corner of the screen, a countdown timer. 18 months, 14 days, 7 hours, 23 minutes. The clock is ticking, and they're about to learn exactly what happens when it reaches 0. The video quality is surprisingly good for something intercepted from a rerouted satellite signal. Crystal clear audio, HD resolution, perfect lighting. Almost as if whoever recorded this wanted it to be found by someone with the right skills and motivation. Nova adjusts the audio levels as familiar faces fill the screen. She recognises at least half of them. Pharmaceutical CEOs who've been in the news, tech moguls who've testified before Congress, government officials whose names appear in leaked documents weekly. But it's the people she doesn't recognise that worry her more. Faces that suggest power operates in layers the public never sees. Audio check, a voice says off-screen. We're recording for the archive. All participants have been verified through biometric confirmation. Proceed with briefing, responds a woman Nova recognises as the director of the World Health Organization. Phase 3 implementation status. A man in his 60s, distinguished silver hair, appears in a separate window. The nameplate reads, Dr. Harrison Vale, Protean Core Industries. Nova makes a mental note. She's never heard of Protean Core, which means they've done excellent work staying invisible. Phase 3 is proceeding on schedule, Dr. Vale reports. Biometric surveillance systems are now operational in 847 rural zones across 17 countries. Heat mapping, fertility tracking, and genetic sequencing capabilities are running at full capacity. Jax pauses their other work to focus on the video. Genetic sequencing? That's not something you can do remotely. Unless, Kale says slowly, you've already collected samples through other means. On screen, Dr. Vale continues. Integration with consumer health devices has exceeded projections. Voluntary data submission through fitness trackers, smartphones, and IoT medical devices now covers 73% of target demographics in developed nations. Nova feels her blood turn cold. She looks at the fitness tracker on her own wrist, a gift from her sister 2 Christmases ago. The little device that's been monitoring her heart rate, sleep patterns, stress levels. The device that connects to her phone, which connects to the cloud, which connects to... Smart device penetration in rural areas remains challenging, Dr. Vale continues, but our partnerships with agricultural technology companies have provided alternative collection methods. Genetic material harvested through routine veterinary procedures on livestock has proven surprisingly effective for human population mapping. What the hell does that mean? Jax whispers. Kale's face has gone ashen. Cross-species genetic contamination. If they're introducing human genetic markers into livestock, then tracking the animal genetics. They can map human populations through the food chain, Nova finishes. Every hamburger, every glass of milk, every piece of chicken carries genetic data. On screen, the meeting continues. A younger man, maybe 40, appears in a new window. His nameplate reads, Marcus Chen, Global Agricultural Systems. Nova notices the shared surname but feels no family connection, only revulsion. Agricultural vector deployment is exceeding expectations, Marcus reports. mRNA modification systems are now integrated into feed supplies for cattle, poultry and swine across North America and Europe. Human consumption data indicates 94% population exposure through dietary intake. Side effects, asks the WHO director. Minimal immediate impact as designed. However, fertility rates in test regions are down 23% year over year, with accelerating decline patterns. Autoimmune responses are appearing within expected parameters. Nova's hands shake as she realizes what they're watching. These aren't plans being discussed. These are progress reports on operations already in motion. Lynx leans closer to the screen. That voice. I know that voice. A new participant joins the call, their video window appearing in the center of the screen. The image is deliberately obscured. Shadows and lighting designed to hide identity. But the voice is clear and authoritative. Psychological conditioning remains our most effective vector, the shadowed figure reports. Media saturation campaigns have successfully normalized concepts of population reduction, climate-based selection, and voluntary extinction movements. Social media algorithms are amplifying despair, hopelessness, and anti-natalist sentiment across target demographics. Mental fatigue campaigns, the WHO director asks, exceeding projections. Suicide rates in target age ranges are up 34% year over year. Birth rates continue declining as planned. Most importantly, resistance to authority has decreased significantly. Population compliance with future directives is expected to be near universal. Jack stands up abruptly, knocking over their chair. They're not just poisoning our bodies, they're poisoning our minds. Nova pauses the video, needing a moment to process what they're witnessing. This isn't just biological warfare. It's psychological, social, environmental. They've weaponized everything we depend on to survive. Food, air, water, information, Lynx lists. They're not attacking civilization. They've turned civilization into the weapon. Kale sits down heavily, his scientific worldview crumbling and reforming around this new reality. The fertility decline, the autoimmune disorders, the psychological depression epidemics, it's all connected. It's all intentional. Nova resumes the video. The shadowed figure continues speaking. Phase 4. Preparation is nearly complete. Environmental triggers are in position. When activated, they will catalyze the biological modifications already present in target populations. Estimated timeline for full effect 18 months. The WHO director nods. Excellent. What about resistance potential? Minimal. Independent researchers who've approached relevant discoveries have been discredited, defunded, or eliminated from academic and professional positions. Media coverage of related topics has been successfully redirected toward established conspiracy theory frameworks, ensuring any accurate information is dismissed as paranoid delusion. Nova feels the walls of their warehouse closing in. How many others have found pieces of this puzzle? How many have been silenced? Dr. Vale, the shadowed figure continues. Status report on asset protection. Dr. Vale reappears on screen. Protection protocols are operational. All essential personnel and their families have received modified treatments. Genetic compatibility with post-implementation environment is confirmed. We estimate a protected population of approximately 500,000 globally. 500,000, Jax repeats numbly, out of 7 billion. The video quality starts to degrade as the satellite connection becomes unstable. But one final exchange comes through clearly. Any concerns about detection? Unlikely. The full scope of the operation requires integration of data from medical, agricultural, environmental, technological and psychological sources. No single research team or intelligence agency has access to all vectors simultaneously. Except, the WHO director adds with something approaching dark humour, they would need to be simultaneously expert in cryptography, intelligence gathering, virology, social engineering, and information systems. The shadowed figure laughs. The probability of such a team existing with access to the right data and the motivation to pursue it is essentially zero. The connection dies, leaving their warehouse in silence. Nova, Lynx, Jax, and Kael look at each other across the digital evidence of humanity's planned extinction. Well, Nova says finally, I guess we're essentially zero. But as the four of them return to their workstations, preparing to dive deeper into the nightmare they've uncovered, None of them notice the small indicator light on Jax's communication system. The light that shows someone has been monitoring their network traffic. The light that means their essentially zero probability team has just become a confirmed threat. The light that means Phase 4 might be starting ahead of schedule. The warehouse's early warning system starts screaming at 4:17 a.m, 3 hours after they finished analysing the intercepted conference call. Nova jolts awake from her desk, where she'd fallen asleep reviewing genetic modification patents. The screens around her flash red as multiple intrusion detection systems trigger simultaneously. "Lynx!" she shouts, adrenaline cutting through exhaustion. "We've got company!" Lynx rolls out of his sleeping bag, grabbing his laptop and a go bag he keeps permanently packed, old habits from his intelligence days. "What kind of company?" "The kind that uses military-grade network penetration tools," Nova responds, her fingers flying across keyboards as she tries to lock down their systems. "Someone's been watching us." Jax appears from the back room, purple hair messy from sleep but their eyes sharp with focus. "How long have they been in our network?" "Unknown," Nova admits, fighting a losing battle against the intrusion. "But they've got root access to our communication systems. They've seen everything." Kale emerges from his makeshift lab, clutching a hard drive. "I've backed up all the biological data to an isolated system. If we lose the main servers..." "We're losing everything," Nova confirms, watching as file after file disappears from their local storage. They're not just infiltrating, they're sanitizing, removing all traces of what we've found. But even as their digital fortress crumbles around them, Nova's mind races ahead to their backup protocols. Years of paranoia have taught her to prepare for exactly this scenario. "Jax, activate the mesh network. Lynx, get the satellite uplink ready. We're going distributed." The warehouse transforms as hidden systems come online. What appeared to be a simple hacker den reveals itself as a sophisticated intelligence operation. Jax's workstation unfolds into a multi-array communication hub. Lynx produces equipment that definitely didn't come from civilian sources. Nova's desk reveals hidden servers and backup power systems. "Professor," Nova calls, "how much of your research is stored offline?" "Everything critical," Kale confirms. "I learned not to trust cloud storage after they destroyed my academic career." As their attackers continue dismantling their main systems, the team executes an evacuation protocol they've rehearsed, but hoped never to use. Critical files transfer to multiple secure locations. Communication channels shift to encrypted networks. Physical evidence gets packed into go bags. But Nova isn't running yet. Instead, she's doing something that would seem insane to anyone who doesn't understand her particular brand of digital warfare. She's tracing the intrusion back to its source. "What are you doing?" Lynx demands, watching her work as alarms continue screaming around them. "If they're watching us," Nova says through gritted teeth, "then we're watching them back." Her screen fills with a network traffic analysis, packet traces, and routing information. The attack is sophisticated, routed through multiple proxy servers and anonymization networks. But sophistication creates complexity, and complexity creates vulnerabilities. "There," she breathes, highlighting a data stream. "They're not just stealing our files, they're uploading something." The upload completes just as Nova isolates the data stream, a single file placed carefully in their system logs where it would be discovered during any forensic analysis. Child pornography, Lynx realizes, reading the file metadata. They're setting us up. When law enforcement finds this place, we'll be dismissed as perverts and criminals instead of researchers, Nova finishes. Brilliant. Completely discredit us while making sure no one looks too closely at what we actually found. But Nova's trace has revealed something else, the real location of their attackers, and it's not some anonymous hacker collective or foreign government. They're operating out of the Protean Core building, she announces. Dr. Harrison Vale's company. The same people we watched discussing humanity's extinction 3 hours ago. Jax finishes packing their equipment. "We need to leave, now." But Nova is still working, her fingers moving with the desperate speed of someone who knows this might be their last chance. Not yet. If they're monitoring us in real time, if they know what we've discovered, then they know we're a threat, which means... Her screen fills with a new data stream. Not an attack this time, but intercepted communications from the Protean Core building. They're having an emergency meeting, she realizes. Right now, about us. She patches the audio through their speakers, and suddenly the warehouse fills with voices they recognize from the earlier recording. Confirmed they have the Phase 3 documentation, Dr. Vale's voice reports. Full technical specifications, implementation timelines, biological modification protocols. How is that possible? The WHO director's voice sounds strained. That information is compartmentalized across 17 different security classifications. Unknown, but their research capabilities suggest state-level intelligence resources. We may have a coordinated opposition. A new voice joins the call, the shadowed figure from the earlier recording, though now speaking with urgent authority rather than calm confidence. Irrelevant. They know enough to compromise the entire operation if they go public. We need immediate containment. What kind of containment? Dr. Vale asks. Total. The team, their research, their facility. Make it look like a lab accident. Chemical fire, explosion, whatever ensures complete evidence destruction. Nova's blood turns to ice as she realizes what they're planning. How long do we have? The WHO director asks. Tactical team is en route, 20 minutes. Nova starts shutting down systems, her movements sharp with controlled panic. We're blown. They're sending a kill team. 20 minutes? Jax checks their watch. That's not enough time to... It's enough time to do one thing, Nova interrupts, pulling up her final contingency protocol. We can't save ourselves, but we can save the evidence. She begins uploading their complete research archive to a decentralized network. Blockchain-based storage systems that can't be deleted or controlled by any single authority. But the upload is massive, and their internet connection is already compromised. Upload time, 17 minutes, her system reports. 3 minutes to spare, Link says grimly, checking his weapons, if their timeline is accurate. But as if summoned by his words, new alarms start screaming. Motion sensors around the warehouse perimeter. Thermal imaging detecting multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. They lied about the timeline, Nova realizes. The team is already here. Through the grimy windows, they can see black SUVs surrounding the building. Tactical lights sweep across the walls. Radio chatter echoes from outside, professional, coordinated, lethal. Upload progress, 32%, her computer announces. Nova looks at her team, her friends, her fellow travellers in the digital underground. Jax with their fierce intelligence and boundless optimism. Lynx with his warrior's honour and protective instincts. Kale with his scientist's dedication to truth above comfort. I need 8 more minutes to finish the upload, she says quietly. Can you give me 8 minutes? Lynx checks his rifle, the same model he carried during his government service. Against a professional tactical team? In an indefensible position? He looks around the warehouse, their home, their sanctuary, their last stand. Yeah, he says finally, we can give you 8 minutes. As the first breaching charges explode against the warehouse doors, Nova's fingers continue dancing across her keyboard, uploading humanity's final testimony to the digital wind. Outside, boots pound against concrete and orders are shouted in tactical shorthand. Inside, 4 people who stumbled across the end of the world fight to make sure someone, somewhere, will know what really happened to the human race. The upload bar crawls toward completion, 47%, 48%, Sasipgu Peosentu, and in the distance sirens wail, though whether they're coming to help or to clean up the mess, nobody can tell. Upload progress, 73%. Nova's fingers move across the keyboard with mechanical precision, even as automatic weapons fire tears through the warehouse's steel walls. Lynx and Jax have improvised a defensive position behind stacked servers, returning fire with a small arsenal Lynx maintained for exactly this scenario. Kyle crouches beside Nova, clutching his backup drives like sacred relics. How much longer? Lynx shouts over the gunfire, ejecting an empty magazine. 3 minutes, Nova responds, sweat dripping onto her keyboard as she maintains the upload connection, despite power fluctuations from damaged systems. A tactical team member appears at a broken window. Jax takes him down with a shot that would make their grandfather proud. The same grandfather who taught them to shoot cans off fence posts in rural Oregon, never imagining his lessons would one day be used to defend the future of human civilization. Upload progress, 81%. Nova! Kale shouts, pointing at the main screen. They're jamming our satellite connection. She looks up to see their upload speed dropping rapidly. The decentralized network storage is failing as targeted electromagnetic pulses disrupt their communication arrays. Years of preparation, layers of redundancy, multiple backup systems, all being systematically neutralised by an enemy who understands their capabilities better than they understand themselves. "Switch to the hard line," she orders, pulling cables from emergency ports hidden beneath the floor. "If the satellites are down, we go terrestrial." But even as she reroutes their connection through buried fibre optic cables, her screens show the truth. Their attackers aren't just soldiers. They're technicians, equipped with signal intelligence gear and digital warfare tools. This isn't a military assault, it's a surgical data extraction and elimination operation. Upload progress, 89%. They're inside the network, Nova realises, watching as files begin corrupting during transfer. They're not jamming the connection, they're poisoning it. Malicious code floods through their internet connection, targeting not just their local systems, but the destination servers themselves. Wherever they try to upload their evidence, the same destructive algorithms follow, erasing data as fast as they can transmit it. 90 seconds, Lynx reports, reloading his rifle. "That's all I can give you." Nova's mind races through alternatives. Local storage, compromised. Cloud servers, compromised. Peer-to-peer networks, compromised. Everywhere they turn, the digital tentacles of their enemies have already reached. But there's one option they haven't tried. One network that exists outside the normal channels of internet communication. "Jax!" she shouts. "Emergency radio protocols. Can you reach the ham radio networks?" Jax nods, understanding immediately. While their enemies have prepared for digital warfare, they might not have anticipated analog communication methods, ancient radio technology that predates the internet by decades. As Jax frantically assembles radio equipment, Nova begins compressing their data files into formats suitable for audio transmission. Everything they've discovered about Project Aegis, the population reduction protocols, the biological modification systems, compressed into digital packets that can be transmitted over shortwave radio frequencies. Upload progress, 94%. Transmission corrupted. Their internet connection dies completely as electromagnetic pulse weapons finish destroying their communication arrays. But Jax's radio equipment sparks to life, connecting them to a network of amateur radio operators who maintain communication protocols independent of corporate or government control. "This is Emergency Station Alpha calling CQ Emergency," Jax broadcasts. "We have critical data for immediate relay to all stations. Repeat, critical data for immediate relay." Responses crackle back from radio operators across the country, retired engineers, electronics hobbyists, disaster relief volunteers, people who maintain the last truly free communication network on the planet. Nova begins transmitting their compressed data files, sending fragments to different radio operators with instructions for reassembly and distribution. It's slow, inefficient and incomplete, but it's working. Until the lights go out. Emergency power kicks in, bathing the warehouse in red light as their main electrical systems fail. Through the broken windows they can see technicians working on power lines, systematically isolating the building from the electrical grid. "They're cutting everything," Kale observes. "Power, internet, radio frequency spectrum, complete communication isolation." Nova's laptop switched to battery power, giving her perhaps 10 minutes of operation before total system failure. She continues transmitting data packets over Jax's radio equipment, but the process is agonizingly slow. "Nova!" Lynx calls urgently. "Movement on the roof. They're coming through the skylights." She looks up to see tactical team members rappelling through the warehouse's ceiling. Professional, coordinated, equipped with night vision and thermal imaging. In 30 seconds, they'll have complete control of the space. In 30 seconds, Project Aegis will remain humanity's best-kept secret. But Nova has one final option. One last desperate gambit that violates every principle of operational security she's ever followed. She activates her personal phone's livestream function and begins broadcasting directly to social media. "My name is Nova Chen," she says, looking directly into the camera as gunfire echoes around her. "If you're watching this, you need to know that the world's governments and corporations are planning to kill most of the human race." Her phone's screen shows viewer counts climbing rapidly. Hundreds, then thousands of people drawn by the chaos and violence of her livestream. They call it Project Aegis, population reduction through biological modification. They've poisoned the vaccines, contaminated the food supply, weaponized the environmental monitoring systems. Tactical team members breach their defensive position, Link's falls, blood spreading across the concrete floor. Jax continues working the radio, transmitting data even as red laser sights dance across their chest. The timeline is 18 months, Nova continues, holding the phone steady despite the chaos. They've already begun implementation. If you've been vaccinated, if you eat processed food, if you use smart devices, you're already carrying the biological modifications they need to. A tactical team member's rifle butt smashes into her skull, sending the phone spinning across the concrete floor. The livestream continues, showing a sideways view of combat boots and spreading pools of blood, but the damage is done. In the 3 minutes her stream was active, over 50,000 people watched Nova Chen's final testimony. And in the age of social media, 50,000 becomes 5 million in a matter of hours. The last thing her phone's camera captures before the screen goes black is a gloved hand reaching down to pick it up. In the background, a voice speaks with calm authority. Sanitize everything. No evidence, no witnesses, no trace this facility ever existed. Then static, then silence, then nothing. 6 months later. The official report from the Woodland Fire Department described it as a tragic industrial accident. Improper storage of chemical solvents in a converted warehouse led to an explosion that killed 4 squatters and destroyed the building completely. Local news covered it for exactly 1 day before moving on to more compelling stories. The livestream that briefly appeared on various social media platforms was quickly removed for violating community guidelines against violent content and misinformation. Users who tried to share or discuss it found their accounts suspended or shadow banned. Within a week it had been scrubbed from mainstream platforms entirely. But the internet remembers everything, especially the things someone desperately wants forgotten. On encrypted message boards and dark web forums, fragments of Nova's final broadcast circulate like digital samizdat. Grainy screenshots, audio clips, transcribed quotes passed from user to user through carefully maintained networks of paranoid technologists and dedicated conspiracy researchers. Truth Seeker 2030 posts on an anonymous forum. Anyone else remember that warehouse livestream from 6 months ago? The girl talking about Project Aegis? Can't find it anywhere now, but I swear I downloaded a copy. Digital Ghost responds. Had the same video. File corrupted when I tried to open it last week. All my Aegis research just disappeared, like it was never there. Red Pill Reality chimes in. Same here. But I remember what she said. Population reduction, biological modifications, food supply contamination, 18 months. We're down to 12 months now. The conversations multiply across platforms that exist in the shadows of the normal internet. Ham radio operators share fragments of the data Jax transmitted in those final minutes. Academic researchers quietly compare notes about unusual patterns in pharmaceutical trials and agricultural modifications. Environmental scientists notice anomalies that match the warnings from a warehouse that officially never existed. Dr. Sarah Martinez, epidemiologist at UC Davis, publishes a paper about unexplained fertility decline in rural agricultural communities. She doesn't mention Project Aegis directly, but her data matches the patterns Nova's team identified with unsettling accuracy. Professor David Kim at MIT releases research about novel proteins found in certain vaccine batches, proteins with no apparent therapeutic function. His funding gets cut 3 weeks later, and his department chair suggests he focus on less controversial research topics. Environmental journalist Lisa Chen, no relation to Nova despite the shared surname, investigates reports of unusual biometric surveillance equipment appearing in remote areas. Her article gets killed by her editor, who explains that the magazine's parent company has concerns about unfounded conspiracy theories. But each cancelled publication, each suppressed research project, each deleted social media post creates a new data point in a pattern that becomes hard to ignore. The truth spreads like a virus through the digital underground. 12 months later, Maya Patel is 17 years old and has never heard of Nova Chen, Lynx Rodriguez, Jax Morrison, or Professor Kale. She lives in a small village in rural India, where internet access is limited, and social media is considered a luxury for urban elites. But Maya is smart, curious, and has access to her school's computer lab 3 days a week. She spends her time learning about environmental science, genetic engineering, and the intersection of technology and biology. Her dream is to study at a Western university and help solve the world's agricultural challenges. It's during one of these computer lab sessions that she finds the flash drive. buried in a box of discarded electronics donated to the school, wrapped in plastic and electrical tape like someone tried very hard to preserve it. The label, written in faded ink, reads, Population Zero Proof.Vault. Maya plugs it into the computer, expecting maybe some students' old homework or family photos. Instead, she finds 847 gigabytes of encrypted data files, research documents, intercepted communications, and video recordings. She finds genetic modification protocols, pharmaceutical patents, agricultural contamination systems, and psychological warfare strategies. She finds the complete archive of everything Nova Chen's team discovered about Project Aegis. The encryption is military grade, but Maya is patient and clever. She spends 3 weeks cracking the access codes, working during lunch breaks and staying after school until the janitor kicks her out. When she finally opens the files, she spends another week just trying to understand what she's looking at. Population reduction through coordinated biological intervention. Genetic modification systems activated by environmental triggers. Food chain contamination designed to cause sterility and immune system failure. Psychological warfare campaigns to normalize extinction and reduce resistance to authority. A timeline that originally targeted 2030, but has been accelerated to 2027. Maya realizes she's looking at the blueprint for humanity's planned extinction, and according to the timestamps on the most recent files, the final phase is scheduled to begin in 6 months. She copies everything to multiple storage devices and begins the careful process of verification, cross-referencing patent filings, pharmaceutical research, agricultural modifications, environmental monitoring data. Every piece of evidence Nova's team gathered, Maya confirms through independent research. It's all true. It's all happening. And almost nobody knows. But Maya Patel is 17 years old, raised in a culture that reveres education and truth-telling above personal safety. She doesn't consider keeping the information secret. She doesn't wonder if she might be wrong. She doesn't worry about the consequences of speaking truth to power. She uploads everything to every platform she can access. WikiLeaks, anonymous file-sharing networks, academic databases, social media platforms, government transparency websites, journalist tip lines, activist organizations, environmental groups, medical research communities. She translates key documents into 17 languages and distributes them through international networks. She creates simplified summaries for non-technical audiences and detailed analyses for subject matter experts. She floods the internet with the truth about Project Aegis, and this time it's too late to stop the signal. Within hours, Maya's uploads are being downloaded thousands of times. Within days, the downloads become millions. Major news outlets pick up the story. Government officials demand investigations. International health organizations call emergency sessions. The carefully orchestrated plan to reduce human population through biological warfare becomes the most documented conspiracy in human history. Dr. Harrison Vale attempts to discredit the documents as sophisticated forgeries. The WHO director claims the communications were taken out of context. Government officials deny any knowledge of population reduction protocols. But the evidence is overwhelming, the documentation is comprehensive, and the verification is independent. Too many researchers, in too many countries, using too many different methodologies, all reach the same conclusion. Project Aegis is real, it's operational, and it's working. Global fertility rates have dropped 34% over the past 3 years. Autoimmune disorders have increased 78% in demographics that received certain vaccine formulations. Agricultural workers in modified crop regions show genetic markers consistent with engineered biological agents. Psychological depression and suicide rates have reached historic highs in precisely the age groups targeted by media manipulation campaigns. The population reduction protocol isn't a future threat. It's already killed millions of people. 18 months after the warehouse, Maya Patel stands before the International Criminal Court in The Hague, testifying about the greatest crime in human history. Behind her sits a display showing population statistics, fertility decline curves, mortality data, and genetic modification evidence. She holds up a small flash drive, the same one she found in a box of discarded electronics in her school's computer lab. This device, she tells the court, contains the complete records of Project Aegis, compiled by 4 researchers who died trying to warn the world about what was being done to us. She sets the drive on the witness stand. Nova Chen was 26 years old when she was murdered for discovering that our governments and corporations had poisoned the human race. Lynx Rodriguez was 32 when he died, defending her right to tell the truth. Jax Morrison was 21 when they gave their life to upload this evidence to radio networks around the world. Professor Kale was 58 when he was killed for asking the wrong questions about biological modification research. Maya looks directly at the defendants, pharmaceutical executives, government officials, and corporate leaders who sit in chains behind bulletproof glass. They died so that we could live. They died so that humanity would know what was done to us. They died so that the people responsible for the greatest genocide in history would be held accountable. She picks up the flash drive again. Their names were Nova, Lynx, Jax, and Kyle. They saved our species, and they want you to remember that the truth is always worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the people who want to hide it. The courtroom falls silent as Maya's testimony ends. In the gallery, family members of victims weep quietly. In the press section, journalists furiously type stories that will reach billions of readers within hours, and in a small village in rural India, a 17-year-old girl's computer science teacher watches the live broadcast and smiles proudly at his former student. Sometimes the truth finds a way. Sometimes the good guys win. Sometimes 4 people in a warehouse can save the world, even after they're gone. Epilogue. The network remembers, 5 years later, the Maya Patel Institute for Digital Truth and Transparency occupies a gleaming building in New Geneva, funded by reparations payments from the corporations responsible for Project Aegis. Its mission statement, carved in stone above the entrance, reads, "The network remembers everything, especially the things someone desperately wants forgotten." In the lobby, 4 portraits hang side by side. Nova Chen, cryptographer and digital warrior; Lynx Rodriguez, intelligence analyst and protector; Jax Morrison, social engineer and technological prodigy; Professor Kyle, virologist and truth-teller. Beneath their portraits a simple inscription: "They found the code that wasn't meant to be found." Tourists and students pass by the portraits daily, most not knowing the full story of how 4 people in a converted warehouse prevented the extinction of human civilization. But the staff of the Institute know, the researchers working on digital rights and technological transparency know, the activists fighting against corporate surveillance and biological manipulation know. And late at night, when the building is empty and the servers hum quietly in climate-controlled rooms, network traffic monitors occasionally detect unusual patterns in the data streams. Fragments of code that shouldn't exist, routed through pathways that don't appear on any network topology. Some say it's just background noise, artifacts of old systems and deprecated protocols. Others believe it's something more, digital ghosts of 4 researchers who refuse to let death stop their work, still uploading, still broadcasting, still fighting to keep the truth alive in the spaces between the data. The network remembers everything, and sometimes, late at night in the digital underground, the network remembers back.